The morning of June 3rd, 1942 dawned clear and deceptively peaceful over the Central Pacific. Captain Miles Browning stood on the bridge of the USS Enterprise, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched the endless expanse of blue water stretch to the horizon. The carrier's deck crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing the dauntless dive bombers for what would become the most decisive naval battle in American history. Admiral Chester Nimitz had gambled everything on this moment. Intelligence intercepts had revealed Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's ambitious plan to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a trap at Midway Atoll, but Nimitz had turned the tables. Instead of walking into an ambush, the Americans would be waiting. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles and checked his instrument panel one final time. The young pilot from Buffalo had no idea that within hours, his decisions would help determine the fate of the Pacific War. Round him, 36 other dive bomber pilots made their final preparations, their Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft gleaming. In the morning sun, the Japanese combined fleet, under Yamamoto's command, represented the pinnacle of naval power. For aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu formed the striking force, protected by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, commanded this formidable armada with supreme confidence. On Midway itself, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon watched through binoculars as the first wave of Japanese aircraft approached. The tiny atoll, barely 6 miles across, seemed impossibly small to serve as the fulcrum for such a massive confrontation. Yet this speck of coral and sand in the vast Pacific would witness the turning point of the war. According to historical accounts documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the stage was set for a battle that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Pacific. The Americans had managed to position 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, while the Japanese fleet approached from the northwest. The tension aboard the American ships was palpable. Sailors who had survived Pearl Harbor knew they were facing the same enemy that had delivered that devastating blow, but this time, they held the advantage of surprise and superior intelligence. Captain Mark Mitcher of the USS Hornet gathered his pilots for a final briefing, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. As the sun climbed higher, radar operators on Midway began detecting the first Japanese aircraft. The battle would begin not with the clash of carrier forces, but with Japan's attempt to neutralize the American base. Zero fighters and Val dive bombers screamed toward the atoll, their engines creating a thunderous roar that would herald one of history's most significant naval engagements. The defenders of Midway, Marines, Navy personnel, and Army Air Force crews took their positions. They knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they also knew that every minute they could delay the Japanese assault would give the carrier forces more time to strike. The fate of the Pacific, and perhaps the entire war, hung in the balance as the first bombs began to fall on the coral runway of Midway Atoll. The screaming whine of Japanese aircraft engines shattered the morning calm at 0630 hours. On June 4, 1942, Captain Cyril Simmerd, commanding Midway's defenses, watched from his bunker as 108 enemy aircraft approached in perfect formation. The first wave of Nagumo's attack had arrived. Marine Captain Marion Carl scrambled his Wildcat fighters into the air, knowing they faced overwhelming odds. The obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters that formed the backbone of Midway's air defense were no match for the legendary Zero, but the Marines launched anyway. 26 American fighters rose to meet the incoming armada, their pilots fully aware this might be their final flight. The air battle over Midway erupted with savage intensity. Zeros dove and climbed with deadly grace, their cannon fire tearing through the slower American aircraft. Lieutenant George Gay, flying one of the few modern Wildcats, managed to down to enemy bombers before a Zero's bullets found his engine. He nursed his damaged fighter back toward the carrier Hornet, now racing toward the battle zone at maximum speed. On the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision. The first strike on Midway had encountered heavier resistance than expected, and damage reports indicated the airfield remained operational. His staff urged him to prepare a second attack on the atoll, but disturbing news arrived from reconnaissance flights. American ships had been spotted to the northeast. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the legendary pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, stood beside Nagumo on Akagi's bridge. The carrier's deck was crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for the second Midway strike. Fukuda could see the urgency in his admiral's eyes as reports continued to pour in about the missed, riotous American naval force. The decision that would doom the Japanese fleet came at 07:15. Nagumo ordered his aircraft to be rearmed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship operations instead of the high-explosive bombs intended for Midway. Deck crews frantically began the dangerous process of changing ordnance, while fuel lines snaked across the flight decks. Meanwhile, aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance made his own fateful decision. Despite being outnumbered and lacking complete intelligence about enemy positions, he ordered an immediate strike against the Japanese carriers. Every available aircraft would be launched, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, in a coordinated assault that would either cripple the enemy or result in devastating American losses. Historical records from the Naval War College indicate that this moment represented the culmination of months of preparation and intelligence gathering. The American codebreakers had given their fleet commanders an unprecedented advantage, but success would ultimately depend on the skill and courage of individual pilots and crew members. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron gathered his torpedo Squadron 8 aboard the USS Hornet. The 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers under his command were obsolete and vulnerable, but they would spearhead the American attack. Waldron's final words to his men were prophetic. "If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." As the American strike force took off from their carriers, the Japanese fleet continued its frantic preparations. On the carrier Kaga, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Kasaka supervised the rearming of his dive bombers, unaware that American aircraft were already racing toward his position. The fate of the Pacific War would be decided in the next few hours by young men who had never imagined they would hold such responsibility. The stage was set for the most decisive carrier battle in naval history, with both sides committed to actions that would determine the outcome of the entire Pacific campaign. At 0930 on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his 15 Devastator torpedo bombers into what would become aviation history's most heroic sacrifice. The obsolete TBD aircraft, loaded with heavy Mark 13 torpedoes, lumbered through the morning sky toward the Japanese fleet. At barely 150 miles per hour, Waldron had trained his men relentlessly for this moment. The 41-year-old pilot from Fort Pierre, South Dakota, possessed an intuitive understanding of naval warfare that bordered on genius. As his squadron approached the enemy carriers, he knew they faced almost certain death, but he also knew their sacrifice might save the American fleet. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been alerted to the incoming attack. Lieutenant Commander Shigeo Itaya led 18 Zero fighters in a diving attack on the slow-moving American torpedo bombers. The Zeros, flying at over 300 miles per hour, closed the distance with devastating speed. Their 20mm cannons opened fire at extreme range, sending tracers streaking toward the vulnerable Devastators. Ensign George Gay, flying as Waldron's wingman, watched in horror as the first torpedo bomber exploded in a ball of flame. The pilot, his friend and fellow Academy graduate, never had a chance to bail out. One by one, the Devastators fell to the swarming Zeros, their crews fighting desperately to reach torpedo release range. Waldron's aircraft took multiple hits, but continued flying. The squadron commander's voice crackled over the radio, calm despite the chaos around him. "Watch those fighters," he warned his surviving pilots. "Make your approach count." Moments later, his own aircraft was hit and began smoking heavily. The commander managed to release his torpedo before his Devastator crashed into the Pacific, taking with it one of the Navy's most skilled torpedo pilots. Japanese expansion in the Pacific was permanently halted. The initiative had passed to the United States, which would use it to launch a series of amphibious assaults that would carry American forces to the shores of Japan itself. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, received the victory reports at his headquarters in Pearl Harbor. The 67-year-old Texan, who had gambled everything on the intelligence provided by his codebreakers, now saw his faith vindicated. The same harbor where the American fleet had suffered its greatest defeat had become the launching point for its most decisive victory. The Battle of Midway had lasted for days, but the crucial action had been compressed into a few hours on June 4th. In that brief span, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. The young men who had flown obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds had changed the course of World War II, ensuring that the Pacific would become an American lake rather than a Japanese possession. The heroic sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8, the brilliant navigation of Wade McCluskey, and the courage of countless sailors and airmen had combined to produce a victory that would echo through history. The tiny atoll of Midway, barely visible on most maps, had become the site where American democracy proved its resilience and determination in the face of authoritarian aggression. Only Gay's aircraft remained airborne, and it too was critically damaged. With his gunner dead and his engine failing, Gay managed to release his torpedo at the carrier Kaga before his aircraft hit the water. He would spend the next 30 hours floating in the Pacific, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8's gallant charge. The sacrifice of Waldron's squadron was not in vain. The desperate torpedo attack had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the enemy carriers vulnerable to high-altitude attack. Moreover, the constant threat of American airstrikes had prevented Nagumo from launching his own counterstrike against the American carriers. According to Walter Lord's definitive account in Incredible Victory, the confusion aboard the Japanese carriers reached critical levels as multiple American attacks materialized simultaneously. The precisely coordinated Japanese naval machine was beginning to show signs of strain under the relentless pressure of continuous combat. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the USS Enterprise met a similar fate. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led 14 more devastators against the Japanese fleet, and like Waldron's men, they pressed home their attack despite overwhelming odds. The slow torpedo bombers proved no match for the deadly Zeros, and only 4 aircraft survived the encounter. The pattern repeated with Torpedo Squadron 3 from the USS Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led 12 devastators in the third wave of torpedo attacks, and again the obsolete aircraft were decimated by Japanese fighters. The courage of these airmen was absolute, but their antiquated equipment condemned them to failure. By 1000 hours, the Americans had lost 35 of 41 torpedo bombers committed to the attack. The Japanese carriers remained undamaged, their decks still crowded with aircraft being prepared for the decisive counterstrike. Admiral Nagumo appeared to have weathered the American assault, but the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had accomplished something far more important than sinking ships. They had set the stage for the most devastating surprise attack in naval aviation history. The heroes of the torpedo squadrons would never know how their sacrifice had saved the American fleet, but their gallant charge had given the dive bombers the opportunity. They needed to strike the fatal blow. At 10:24 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peered through the scattered clouds from his perch at 14,000 feet. The 39-year-old pilot from Buffalo had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels. His decision to continue the search would prove to be one of the most crucial moments in naval history. Below him, the 4 Japanese carriers formed a defensive box formation, their decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. The devastating torpedo attacks had ended just minutes before, and Admiral Nagumo's fleet was preparing for its counterstrike against the American carriers. The timing could not have been more perfect for McCluskey's 37 dauntless dive bombers. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been drawn down to sea level by the torpedo attacks. Zero fighters were still recovering altitude when McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. "This is McCluskey. Attack immediately. We're going in." The American dive bombers nosed over into their deadly descent, accelerating to over 150 miles per hour as they plunged toward their targets. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, selected the carrier Akagi for his attack. The massive vessel, flagship of the Japanese striking force, was turning hard to starboard when Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck near the bridge. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and armed aircraft on the hangar deck, creating an inferno that would consume the ship within hours. Simultaneously, the pilots of Bombing Squadron 3 from the USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, dove on the carrier Soryu. The ship's deck was packed with fueled and armed aircraft when 3 direct hits transformed it into a floating volcano. Lieutenant Commander John Powers, despite his aircraft being hit by anti-aircraft fire, pressed his attack to suicidally low altitude before releasing his bomb, ensuring a direct hit before his own aircraft was destroyed. The carrier Kaga became the target of the remaining Enterprise dive bombers. Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best scored a direct hit on the forward elevator, while other pilots planted their bombs among the clustered aircraft. The massive carrier, veteran of Pearl Harbor and numerous Pacific victories, began burning uncontrollably as secondary explosions rocked the vessel. According to Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully's comprehensive analysis in Shattered Sword, these 5 minutes between 10:24 and 10:29 a.m. represented the most decisive moment in Pacific naval warfare. 3 of Japan's fleet carriers were mortally wounded in a span of time shorter than a television commercial break. On the burning Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood transfixed by the devastation. Around him, the carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack was now a raging inferno, its flight deck buckled and twisted by explosions. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, severely wounded in the attack, watched helplessly as months of careful preparation and training were reduced to burning wreckage. The sole surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, immediately began preparing a counterstrike. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division, ordered every available aircraft launched against the American fleet. The 41-year-old admiral, known for his aggressive tactics, was determined to salvage victory from the disaster that had befallen his colleagues. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, his fuel tanks nearly empty, managed to guide his surviving aircraft back to the USS Enterprise. The ship's landing signal officer talked the dive bombers down one by one, several aircraft running out of fuel as they touched down on the carrier's deck. McCluskey's navigation and timing had saved the American fleet, but the battle was far from over. The psychological impact on the Japanese fleet was immediate and devastating. Sailors who had believed themselves invincible watched their mighty carriers burn. Like funeral pyres, the myth of Japanese naval supremacy, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, was dying in the flames consuming the pride of the combined fleet. As the 3 carriers burned out of control, Admiral Yamamoto received the devastating news aboard his flagship Yamato. The architect of Pearl Harbor realized that his carefully planned trap had become a disaster of unprecedented proportions. The fate of the Pacific War had been decided in 5 minutes of American dive bombing. At 1100 hours on June 4, 1942, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Japanese carrier Hiryu, the sole survivor of Nagumo's once mighty striking force. The 51-year-old admiral, known throughout the Imperial Navy for his aggressive spirit, was determined to exact revenge for the destruction of his 3 sister ships. His counterstrike would target the American carrier that had been identified by reconnaissance aircraft, the USS Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga, veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, led 18 Val dive bombers and 60 fighters in the first wave against the American carrier. Despite being wounded in the morning's attack on Midway, Tomonaga insisted on leading the mission personally. His aircraft's fuel tank had been holed by defensive fire, but the dedicated pilot pressed on, knowing he lacked sufficient fuel to return to Hiryu. Captain Elliot Buckmaster commanded the USS Yorktown. the carrier that had been hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. The ship's damage control parties had worked miracles to get her back into action, but she remained vulnerable. As the Japanese aircraft approached, Buckmaster ordered his ship to maximum speed and began evasive maneuvers. The air battle over. The Yorktown erupted at 11:55. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, flying one of the carrier's Wildcat fighters, engaged the incoming Japanese aircraft with his revolutionary Thatchweave tactic. The coordinated defensive maneuver helped the slower American fighters match the superior Zero, but the attackers still broke through the defensive screen. Tomonaga's Valdive bombers screamed down through the anti-aircraft fire, their fixed landing gear giving them a distinctive appearance that American gunners had learned to fear. The first bomb struck the Yorktown's flight deck, penetrating to the hangar deck and igniting aviation fuel. A second bomb hit near the island's superstructure, killing and wounding dozens of sailors. The most devastating hit came when a bomb penetrated the carrier's stack, rupturing steam lines and reducing the ship's speed to just 6 knots. Commander Clarence Aldrich, the ship's damage control officer, worked frantically to restore power and speed. His teams sealed compartments, fought fires, and rerouted steam lines with remarkable efficiency, getting the carrier back to 20 knots within an hour. Historical accounts from the Naval History and Heritage Command describe the heroic efforts of Yorktown's crew during this critical phase. Sailors worked in smoke-filled compartments, many suffering from heat exhaustion and smoke inhalation, but they refused to abandon their posts. Their dedication would give the carrier a fighting chance to survive. Admiral Yamaguchi was not finished. At 1300 hours, he launched a second strike consisting of 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters. Lieutenant Commander Yasuhiro Shigematsu led this attack, his aircraft carrying the deadly Type 91 aerial torpedo that had proven so effective at Pearl Harbor. The torpedo attack on Yorktown began at 14:45. Despite the carrier's renewed speed and desperate evasive maneuvers, 2 torpedoes struck the port side, causing massive flooding and a severe list. The ship's electrical power failed, and Captain Buckmaster reluctantly ordered abandon ship. As the carrier appeared to be sinking, Commander Tomonaga, true to his warrior's code, dove his damaged aircraft directly into the sea after expending his ordnance. The veteran pilot, who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, chose death over the shame of returning without fuel. His sacrifice exemplified the fanatical dedication of Japanese naval aviators, but it also illustrated the hopelessness of their situation. As the afternoon wore on, the burning hulks of 3 Japanese carriers continued to illuminate the Pacific sky. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were beyond saving, their magazines detonating in spectacular explosions that could be seen for miles. The pride of the Japanese Navy was dying in the Central Pacific, taking with it hundreds of experienced pilots and aircrew who could never be replaced. The USS Yorktown, despite her severe damage, refused to sink. Her crew's heroic damage control efforts had kept her afloat, though she lay dead in the water and listing heavily to port. The carrier's agony was far from over, but her survival would provide one final opportunity for American forces to strike back at the remaining Japanese carrier. At 1500 hours on June 4, 1942, the Japanese carrier Hiryu found herself alone in the vast Pacific. The sole survivor of Admiral Nagumo's once invincible striking force, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, believing his attacks had sunk to American carriers, prepared for one final desperate assault. The veteran commander knew that Hiryu's fate was sealed, but he was determined to inflict maximum damage before his ship joined her sisters in the depths. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, despite his earlier heroics, was back in the air leading a hastily assembled strike force from the USS Enterprise. The 24 Dauntless dive bombers under his command represented the Americans' last opportunity to eliminate the remaining Japanese carrier before darkness fell. McCluskey's fuel gauge showed adequate reserves this time, but the psychological pressure was enormous. The hunt for Hiryu had been complicated by the smoke and confusion of the burning Japanese fleet. Scout planes from the Enterprise had finally located the carrier at 1600 hours, steaming northwest at high speed with her escort vessels. The ship appeared undamaged, her flight deck clear and ready for operations, making her an extremely dangerous opponent. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the 1st Division of dive bombers. In their attack on Hiryu, the carrier's anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the American aircraft began their diving runs, filling the sky with deadly blackbursts. The ship's captain, Tomio Kaku, ordered hard starboard rudder, but the evasive maneuver came too late to avoid the plunging dive bombers. The first bomb struck Hiryu's forward elevator, penetrating deep into the ship's bowels before exploding among stored aviation fuel and ordnance. The second hit landed near the bridge, killing several officers and starting uncontrollable fires. Within minutes, the last Japanese carrier was following her sisters into the realm of the doomed. Admiral Yamaguchi gathered his staff on Hiryu's bridge as the fires spread throughout the ship. The 51-year-old admiral, who had graduated from the Naval Academy in the same class as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, refused all suggestions that he abandon his burning flagship. "I am going to share the fate of my ship," he declared, removing his cap and facing toward the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. According to Gordon Prange's exhaustive research in Miracle at Midway, the destruction of Hiryu marked the end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. The 4 carriers sunk at Midway had represented the cream of the Imperial Navy's aircrew, men who had trained for years to achieve their elite status. Their loss could not be replaced by the Japanese training system. Captain Tomio Kaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, joined his admiral in choosing death over dishonor. The 2 men stood together on the bridge as their ship burned around them, singing the Naval Academy song and toasting the Emperor with sake. Their devotion to the Bushido Code was absolute, but their sacrifice would not alter the strategic disaster that had befallen Japan. The surviving Japanese surface ships, led by Admiral Hiroaki Abe's cruiser force, attempted to salvage something from the disaster by bombarding Midway during the night. However, Admiral Spruance wisely refused to be drawn into a night surface action, where Japanese superiority in torpedo warfare might reverse the day's victories. As darkness fell over the Pacific, the magnitude of the Japanese defeat became clear. 4 fleet carriers, a cruiser, and over 300 aircraft had been lost. Along with many of Japan's most experienced pilots, the American losses, while significant, were far less severe. The USS Yorktown and 1 destroyer, plus about 150 aircraft. The strategic implications were staggering. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been shattered in a single day. The combined fleet, which had seemed invincible just 24 hours earlier, was now retreating toward home waters, its carrier aviation arm devastated beyond repair. The initiative in the Pacific War had shifted decisively to the United States. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster from his flagship Yamato, immediately ordered a general retreat. The architect of Pearl Harbor realized that his gamble had failed catastrophically. The trap he had set for the American fleet had instead destroyed the backbone of Japanese naval power, ensuring that the war would continue for years to come. Dawn, on June 5, 1942, revealed the full scope of the disaster that had befallen the Japanese Navy. The 4 carriers that had formed the backbone of Admiral Nagumo's striking force were gone, their twisted hulks either at the bottom of the Pacific or burning uncontrollably as they prepared to join their sisters in the depths. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the attack on Pearl Harbor, lay shattered in the Central Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, stood on the bridge of his flagship Yamato, contemplating the strategic catastrophe that had overwhelmed his carefully planned operation. The 58-year-old fleet commander, who had warned his superiors that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year, realized that his prediction had proved tragically accurate. The window of Japanese opportunity had slammed shut. At Midway, the human cost of the battle was staggering for Japan. Captain Jisaku Okada of the carrier Kaga, Commander Takeshi Kasaka of the Air Group, and hundreds of skilled pilots and aircrew had perished in the flames that consumed the pride of the combined fleet. These men represented years of training and experience that the Japanese Navy could not replace. The elite First Air Fleet, which had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, had been eliminated as an effective fighting force. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the American dive bomber leader whose navigation had proved so crucial, landed aboard the USS Enterprise to a hero's welcome. The Buffalo native had demonstrated that individual initiative and skill could alter the course of history. His decision to continue searching for the Japanese fleet, despite dwindling fuel reserves, had placed American dive bombers in position to deliver the decisive blow. The USS Yorktown, despite her severe battle damage, remained afloat through the heroic efforts of her crew. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had ordered the ship abandoned, but subsequent reconnaissance revealed that she might be salvaged. Commander Clarence Aldrich led a skeleton crew back aboard the listing carrier, working frantically to restore power and reduce the flooding that threatened to claim the ship. The Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the damaged American carrier since the previous evening. At 0600 hours on June 6th, Tanabe fired for torpedoes at the listing Yorktown. Two struck the carrier, and a third hit the destroyer USS Hammond, which was alongside providing assistance. Both ships sank within hours, but their loss could not diminish the magnitude of the American victory. Historical analysis by Samuel Eliot Morrison, in his definitive history of United States naval operations in World War II, emphasizes that Midway represented the turning point of the Pacific War. The battle had demonstrated that American industrial capacity, combined with superior intelligence and the courage of individual servicemen, could overcome the initial advantages enjoyed by the Japanese Empire. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been broken, forcing the empire onto the defensive for the remainder of the war. The planned invasion of Hawaii became impossible, and